are you hoping for this Christmas? Maybe you're hoping for a special gift under the tree. Or maybe you're hoping that this week's festivities go just right. Perhaps you're hoping for a few moments by yourself, or to be surrounded by everyone you love. I'm sure someone is hoping that this year's blessings continue, and someone else is hoping that next year will be very different. I hope that your Christmas is just everything you had hoped it would be. But even if it isn't, we have this moment of Christmas right here, gathered together to celebrate the true hope of the world, God born as a helpless baby on that first Christmas so long ago. No matter what else we might be hoping for, we are here to celebrate the hopes and fears of all the years met in Jesus' birth that first Christmas night. Truth is, that first Christmas wasn't going the way most people had hoped. The Jewish people had been hoping for a Messiah for over 400 years, but they were expecting a powerful, full-grown military warrior, not a helpless, tiny, poor baby. Only Mary and Joseph had any warning that Jesus was going to be born, and I'm sure they hadn't hoped for a scandalous birth so far from home, with strange shepherds barging in unannounced. The Bible story doesn't actually mention an innkeeper, but someone must have given Mary and Joseph a place to stay and loaned them a manger for the newborn Jesus. We may never know exactly what those hosts were hoping for that first Christmas, but I wonder if those unnamed heroes recognized that they were witnessing God's promises fulfilled in a tiny little baby. If they did figure out, after the angels and the shepherds and the magi visited, that God was sleeping in their guest room, I wonder how that changed their lives. I wonder how many of the first Christmas witnesses lived to see God's promises fulfilled 30 years later on the first Easter morning celebration. Whether your Christmas is all you had hoped for, or full of many new surprises, we rejoice that God's gift to us this and every Christmas is the gift of hope in a broken world. The Christmas story reminds us that God comes to angels and shepherds, peasants and kings, to you and to me and to all the world. God sent hope in the form of a tiny baby that first Christmas. But God also wants hope to be born in each of our hearts, not just tonight, but every night. We've heard the Christmas story so many times, we begin to expect that Christmas is full of carols and candles, too much dessert, and too many decorations. We begin to expect that Christmas is magical, and we find ourselves sometimes disappointed in the very real divine blessings of the season. God may not give us everything we had hoped for, but God always gives us what we truly need: hope, joy, peace, and love. Even pastors are tempted to wish for a Christmas like the ones in movies and in cards. A pastoral colleague shared that many years ago, when he was fresh out of seminary and spending most nights all alone in the parsonage, he was so eager to return to his childhood home for Christmas that he left almost immediately after the services were over. Maybe you've had a similar experience or a dream of going home for Christmas and anticipating just a few hours of someone else doing all the work of feeding and entertaining you. By the time he had arrived, he had created a Hallmark movie version of how that day's celebrations were going to go. But he had conveniently forgotten that his mother had a habit of inviting over those who had nowhere else to go on Christmas Day. That year, my friend arrived to discover that the town's most eccentric neighbor had been invited. And as the friendly single pastor, he was expected to entertain the lonely and odd gentleman for most of the afternoon. My friend recalls that as the hours passed, he began to resent how much time he was spending in listening to the man's rambling stories. Finally, as the day's events were wrapping up, The pastor was just about to exhale a large sigh of relief as the man gathered his coat to go. Then, with a large toothless smile, the eccentric gentleman gave the pastor an awkward handshake, declaring this was the best Christmas he had had in quite a long while. And thank you for giving him hope for a blessed new year. Too embarrassed to respond, the pastor simply stared open-mouthed as the gentleman walked off with significantly more pep in his step. My friend sheepishly explains he cannot remember a single gift he gave or received that Christmas. He can't remember a word of the sermon he preached that Christmas Eve. But years later, he can still remember the feeling he had when he recognized Jesus in the face of a man smiling back at him. Hope shows up in places where we might least expect it, during times when we might not be looking for it. Even when we sing and hear and read and share the Christmas story, we might still be surprised when God shows up in the dirty and poor places which resemble our modern-day mangers. God is already present in the rough corners of our world, in the orphanage, the prison, the hospital, the refugee camp. And God is using people just like you and me to spread God's hope to all in need. In every community, there are those who are left out and suffering in some way. It's not always obvious. It might be the neighbor who is hiding their troubles behind a tight smile, or the relative whose sorrows we've all learned to just overlook. Jesus was born in the middle of the everyday affairs of ordinary people, and thus God's hope arrives to ordinary people every day. Our call is to be the one who opens the door and welcomes God's hope into our hearts and shares that hope with all who need to hear it and see it and feel it once again. Like our song says, in this world of sin, where meek souls will receive him still, the dear Christ enters in. We are called to make our hearts ready to receive God's gift of hope in our lives and prepare to recognize it in surprising ways. Most of Bethlehem didn't even notice the Christ child born that night so long ago. And most of us might not recognize the ways in which God shows up in our own communities today. But whether we recognize it or not, God is going to show up and do great things right here in the midst of us, and is offering us to be a part of God's story right here and now. That story is not over yet, and so we gather together to remind ourselves what divine hope really looks like. Hope is trusting in God's promises and letting those promises to lead us to experience true freedom and joy. Hope is believing that God will somehow, someday, change the systems of this earth which seem so unchangeable. Hope is trusting in a reality which we cannot yet comprehend. Someday there will be peace on earth and goodwill for all people, and love will conquer fear, and all will sing for joy. Nearly 500 years ago, Martin Luther pointed out to his congregation on Christmas, "The inn was full. There are many of you who think to yourselves, if only I had been there, how quick I would have been to help the baby. Why don't you do it now? You have Christ in your neighbor. For what you do for your neighbor in need, you do for the Lord Christ himself." Luther's words are still ringing in my ears this Christmas. Whenever we reach out to a neighbor, we are answering the call to be the innkeepers of today, welcoming the poor, the homeless, the refugee, the sick, the lonely, the weak, the grieving. Once we open our hearts to those beloved children of God, we remember that God is still sending hope at Christmas and always. Christmas is a time to consider once again if we are willing to become innkeepers, welcoming the Christ child to be born again in our own lives, Once we open our hearts to God's hope, we begin to experience God's love and joy and peace and grace in ways which really aren't understandable or even explainable. But perhaps the true magic of Christmas is that Christmas isn't really what we hoped for, but instead is a miracle beyond all comprehension. May that miracle of God's love and hope be born again in us tonight as we sing and pray together, "O come to us, abide with us, our Lord Emmanuel."